Only mode.
Commenting on the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard. This is a webinar for brands and retailers, and I'm Megan Westgate, the Executive Director of the Non-GMO Project. Thank you so much for listening and for your interest in this important topic. So first of all, by way of background, in late July 2016, a law was enacted directing the USDA to establish a national bioengineered food disclosure. And the deadline for implementing that standard was 2 years from when the law passed. So July 29th, 2018 is when that standard should be taking effect. The passage of the law directing USDA to create the standard followed 2 decades of Americans demanding GMO labeling, and there was starting to be some very successful grassroots efforts to pass laws at the state level, and in response to that, this federal law got momentum and traction, partly as a mechanism for preempting all of those state laws. So with the passage of the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard in July of 2016, all of the state efforts became null and void. The USDA held an initial public comment period last July on the standard. They asked 30 questions and started to collect input to direct the development of this standard. And then because the implementation deadline is this July, all winter and spring, many of us were waiting day by day, week by week to see when they would publish the actual fully developed draft standard. Finally, on May 3rd, the USDA did publish that draft standard, which was meant to outline the actual rules for GMO labeling, and we'll get more into whether or not it did that in just a moment. But just the final piece of background here is that the USDA is currently accepting comment through July 3rd. And so that's the focus of this webinar, is to help you understand what are the key issues to comment on and to encourage you to submit your comments. So just a little bit of background also on the Non-GMO Project's position about this. The Non-GMO Project is a nonprofit organization that believes that everyone has a right to know what's in their food and deserves access to non-GMO choices. Sometimes people ask us, because it's well known that we have the most well-established third-party program for non-GMO claims, and it seems like maybe our agenda would be at odds with having mandatory labeling, but actually we have always been a supporter of meaningful mandatory labeling because we are a mission-driven nonprofit, and anything that brings attention to the GMO issue in an effective way, anything that helps build the non-GMO supply chain and helps ensure that consumers have a meaningful non-GMO choice, is something that aligns with our mission and something that we support. So the draft National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard is about labeling foods that do contain GMOs. It doesn't have any guidelines about non-GMO labeling. So in a way, it's kind of the inverse of the Non-GMO Project. Non-GMO labels, like the Non-GMO Project Butterfly, are outside the scope of this law and standard. And really, the intention of us commenting in this and encouraging others to comment is to leverage our unique experience. We have been operating our nonprofit with our standard and our product verification program for 11.5 years. So we have really unique expertise, both in terms of communicating with consumers and what does the public trust and understand in relation to the GMO issue, but also really significantly with the non-GMO supply chain. So we have really important insight into how this law can be as meaningful as possible. Regardless, though, of how it lands, there is no doubt that the rigor of the Non-GMO Project standard will vastly exceed that of the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard. And so that's one of the reasons that we don't see a conflict between this federal standard and what we do. Regardless of how rigorous this federal standard is, it's focused on disclosure labeling for foods that do have GMO. We know that there is still interest from consumers who are looking for non-GMO, that want that in plain English, to know from an organization they trust that this meets the highest standards for being non-GMO. So we're trusting that the butterfly will remain the go-to symbol for the, now in Hartman's latest report, 46% of shoppers are actively seeking to avoid GMOs. That said, this federal rule is really important, and we have a lot of strong opinions and insight into what will make it as meaningful as possible. So, an overview of the draft before we dive into specific details. The draft rule that was published on May 3rd consists of 84 pages of background and questions, followed by 20 pages of an actual standard. And the reason I actually counted that up to share with you is I wanted to make the point that actually what was published contains many more questions than answers. It really wasn't what many of us were expecting in terms of answering some of the really significant outstanding questions and giving a clear indication of how the final rule will treat things. It's really more what you would expect in an advance notice of rulemaking than in an actual rule. There are, I think, at least 34 different places in the preamble where the USDA asks for further input on things before making a decision. And in the places where questions are answered, for example, definitions, there is cause for concern, and we'll go through that in a moment. So the focus in this presentation, we are by no means covering all the 34 places where the USDA asked for comment. There is a lot more detail, and please do look on our website where this webinar is posted. We'll have links to further information so you can understand the rule in completeness. But what we are focusing on today are the parts of the rules that we believe to be of the greatest significance when it comes to giving Americans a GMO labeling standard that is as meaningful, clear, and accessible as possible. So we've chosen some of the key areas that we just think are absolutely critical that we want to help brands and retailers understand so that you can give USDA meaningful comment on them. So this is kind of organized into 4 sections. First, we'll talk through some of the key points on inclusion and meaningfulness. Those relate to detectability, definitions, thresholds, testing methodology, and the lists of bioengineered food that USDA has included in the draft standard. Then also the importance of clarity in terms of text, language, and symbols, and also accessibility, so the disclosure methods, specifically issues with QR codes and text message. And then finally, we think it's really important for everyone to ask for a reasonable opportunity to comment further once the standard has actually been fully developed. So with that, we are going to dive in, starting with topics on inclusion and meaningfulness. So first off, detectability. This is the #1 issue from our perspective, because if the rule contains an exemption for products in which the modified genetic material cannot be detected, then the majority of GMO foods would be exempt from disclosure. So the key thing for comment here is that the standard should include all GMOs, regardless of whether or not they have detectable transgenic DNA in the finished product. The 2 main categories of things that are at risk for being excluded from the standard if this detectability issue isn't handled right are, first of all, refined and processed food. Most refined and processed food ingredients can't be tested for GMO content because of the limits of current testing methodology. So, for example, if you take canola that is 100% GMO and you test the seed, you will get a test showing that it's completely GMO. If you turn that into a crude oil, you may or may not be able to tell that it's GMO. Once it's a refined oil and you run that same test, you'll get a non-detect. So our point is that just because the test methods currently available cannot show that that canola was GMO doesn't mean that it magically became non-GMO in the processing. So this is a really critical point. The second category of things that are at risk for being exempted if detectability isn't approached comprehensively are all of the new GMOs. So things that are produced through various gene editing techniques like CRISPR and RNAi, products of genetically engineered microbes, which you may have heard referred to as synbio or synthetic biology, all of those things are not yet testable using commercial methods. And so it's really important that detectability be treated comprehensively, and that presence of modified genetic material in the finished product is not the basis for whether or not something is included in the standard. The next point, which is closely related on inclusion, is the definitions. If bioengineering is defined too narrowly in the standard, again, it could exempt all of the new GMOs, and it potentially could also exempt things that are not testable, that don't have transgenic DNA in the finished product. So our recommendation is that this standard from the USDA should use the definition that's used in Codex Alimentarius. That's a collection of global food safety standards, and this is arguably the most authoritative international definition of genetic engineering. It is, for example, what the World Health Organization looks to in resolving trade disputes. And that's one reason why actually the Codex definition of biotechnology is the very same one that the Non-GMO project uses in our standard. So the Codex definition is as follows: that modern biotechnology is the application of in vitro nucleic acid techniques, including recombinant deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and the direct injection of nucleic acid into cells or organelles, or fusion of cells beyond the taxonomic family that overcome natural, physiological, reproductive, or recombinant barriers that are not techniques used in traditional breeding and selection. So the key point here is this is a well-established definition. Again, it's the most authoritative international definition. It's also what the Non-GMO project uses. So rather than inventing a new definition and worrying about how to define various aspects of that definition, one of the things that USDA is asking for input on is how to define and whether they should define conventional breeding and naturally occurring, because those terms are used in their definition. If they would just adopt the Codex definition, they don't have to worry about defining those things, and they would be using something that's already well established. The most critical thing to understand from our perspective is that this definition is sufficiently narrow to be precise, and it's sufficiently broad to include even new GMOs, things that are developed through CRISPR and other types of gene editing, etc. And those types of GMOs are increasingly coming into the marketplace, and really is where a big focus needs to be in the coming years. So if they're excluded from this standard, it's really a big miss in terms of comprehensiveness and meaningfulness for consumers. So another important point on thresholds, on inclusion, is thresholds. So the draft standard lays out 3 different options, and one is that the idea would be that so this language is drafted for what would be exempt. So something would be exempt if it's a food in which an ingredient, this is the first of 3 options, food in which an ingredient contains a bioengineered substance that is inadvertent or technically unavoidable and accounts for no more than 5% by weight of the specific ingredient. I'll read through these and then explain a little bit more what they each mean. Number 2, food in which an ingredient contains a bioengineered substance that is inadvertent or technically unavoidable and accounts for no more than 0.9% by weight of the specific ingredient. Or finally, option 3, food in which the ingredient or ingredients that contain a bioengineered substance account for no more than 5% of the total weight of the food in final form. So basically, the idea here is to either have a threshold where no single ingredient is more than 5%, or no single ingredient is more than 0.9%, or where the cumulative ingredients are not more than 5%. So option 2 is by far the strongest. That lower threshold is the most rigorous, the 0.9%. That aligns the most closely with the regulations used in Europe and also with the threshold used by the Non-GMO project. It is important to note though, that there are some technical errors in how it's presented. And so at the bottom of this slide, you'll see what we are proposing be changed about option number 2, just to make it more technically accurate. So first of all, it shouldn't just be food in which an ingredient, should be food in which any ingredient. That's an important clarification. And then the 0.9% should just be applied to the ingredient, not by weight, because PCR detection of GMO contamination is actually based on the ingredient and not the weight of the ingredient. So I'll spare you going into an elaborate technical explanation of that, but the key point, I think, is to make sure that USDA goes with that more rigorous lower 0.9% threshold. And if you want to just help support the understanding that it shouldn't be by weight, then that's a great thing to add to the comment too. The next thing is testing methodology. So in this draft, while there are several references to testing records, there's actually no detail anywhere in the document about what should be in those testing records. In other words, what constitutes valid content in a testing record. And so Non-GMO project, again, from all of our experience working with supply chains through our technical administrator partners, we've verified more than 50,000 products to date. So we have a very robust understanding of what needs to happen within the supply chain, and particularly with regard to testing, to make sure that the testing is meaningful. So first of all, there should be a requirement that the testing is conducted using either real-time or digital PCR method. Strip tests should not be allowed. PCR is the most sensitive and accurate testing method. And also, testing should be conducted by an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory. It's important to make sure that the test results are meaningful. So it should be a good test method and an accredited lab. Second point is that it's really important that the testing is conducted on a sample where the DNA is intact. So this, again, goes back to the importance of detectability. Like, it's not okay to test a refined oil and say, okay, we got a non-detect, it's non-GMO. There should be a requirement that the input has sufficiently intact DNA to get valid quantitative analysis via PCR. Third, this is also really critical, that there needs to be a valid and meaningful sampling plan used. The way that the material that was tested was pulled from the full lot, how much of it is pulled and where it was pulled from, are absolutely critical in ensuring that the test is representative of the lot that was tested. So we recommend that USDA reference industry standards, for example, GIPSA, to make sure that sampling is done in a valid way. And finally, we believe that tests should demonstrate a GMO content of less than 0.9%, so tying back into that recommended threshold. So one final point on thresholds and testing, and we're nearing the end of like the most dense technical part of the comment, so thanks for hanging in there. One final but important note is that these considerations don't work for new GMOs. So everything that I just said about how to pull samples and make sure that it's PCR tested and that it has a 0.9% threshold, that's only relevant for things where there is a commercially available test. And the new GMOs, the things developed with CRISPR, RNAi, et cetera, don't yet have that. So it's really important, and this has not been addressed at all in the draft standard, it's really important that the standard include affidavit requirements for ingredients that could have been sourced from untestable GMO crops. And this would be in addition to testing records when appropriate. So, for example, right now there are both testable and untestable varieties of genetically engineered canola on the market. So what should constitute sufficient records would be, for canola, that someone should have both compliant testing, so they should show that they sampled properly, that they used an accredited lab and did PCR testing and had a 0.9% threshold, and they should also have an affidavit from the supplier stating that the canola was sourced from seeds that were not developed using oligonucleotide-directed mutagenesis, or ODM, because that's not yet testable. So that is consistent with what the non-GMO project standard is already doing. And again, we feel like that's really critical from a meaningfulness perspective to make sure that these new GMOs are included within the scope of the law. So finally, on inclusion, the lists of bioengineered food. So this draft from USDA has two lists of bioengineered food. One is everything that they consider to be commercially available and highly adopted. And they are proposing, but asking for comment on, a threshold of 85%. So for example, because more than 85% of the corn grown in the US is GMO, that's on the list of things that are commercially available and highly adopted. And the implications of the two lists is if something is on the highly adopted list, it would require a contains bioengineered ingredients disclosure. The second list is things that are commercially available at all. It's not clear if there's a threshold or what the criteria is, but it just seems like anything that's commercially available, then those products would require a may contain disclosure. There's a lot of detail laid out about how the list would be updated, but unfortunately they're proposing that that update only be done on an annual basis. So just by comparison, the non-GMO project uses a 14-point matrix to assess risk level. We actually have a full-time research analyst tracking, because new GMOs are being developed quickly. There's a lot to keep track of, and one of our criteria is that once something passes a 10% adoption rate, we consider it to be widely commercially available, and we require testing and/or affidavits. So that's, I mean, we don't expect the USDA to employ someone full-time to track how GMOs are changing and what's at risk. However, we think that the lists should be more robust than what's proposed. And so specifically, there's three asks. One would be to apply a lower adoption rate. We think 85% is too high to consider something highly adopted. We'd say at a minimum, it should be a 50% adoption rate for the highly adopted list. We would propose a 10% threshold to be applied for the commercially available list. The reason for this is just because something is commercially available doesn't necessarily mean that it poses an imminent threat to the supply chain. One example right now is the Arctic apple, which is commercially available, but it's only being sold pre-packaged. It's not being used in the industrial supply chain at all. And so as soon as something is on that commercially available list, companies are going to have to change their labels and do work to make sure that they're complying. And we think that it should be established that there actually is at least some level of risk to the industrial supply chain before that requirement kicks in. Finally, and this is really important, the final rule should include a mechanism for no less than quarterly updates to the lists. We think annually is just not enough based on what we're seeing. Again, having someone watching all of this full-time every day, there are new GMOs being developed all the time, and a lot would slip through the cracks if this list only gets updated once a year. So now, so we covered the meaningfulness stuff. That was all the things under inclusion. Now we're moving into the second category, which is clear labeling. So once they've clarified what actually is included and they've hopefully treated that in a meaningful way, then the question is, how is that then communicated to the public, and how to make sure that that is communicated in a clear and accessible way. So unfortunately, the only term for disclosure allowed for in the draft rule is bioengineered. Bioengineered is a medical term that is not recognized by consumers. It's not used in the food industry. People do not necessarily associate it with genetic engineering. So what is really important is the rule must allow for disclosure using plain English terms that people understand. The most well-established term, as I'm sure you all know, is genetically engineered. As an example, that's the term used in the Whole Foods GMO labeling transparency policy that was established in 2013, that the majority of brands in the natural products industry are already in compliance with. It's also the language that was used in the various state labeling efforts, and it was the language that was voluntarily adopted by large CPGs like Campbell's. So if the final rule includes this restriction that the word bioengineered is the only word that can be used, what that means is that all of these food companies that now have genetically engineered as their text disclosure would have to change that and would have to not only go through the expense and hassle of changing labels, but at the end of the day would end up with labels that are less clear and meaningful and less transparent to the public. So this is a really critical point for comment, is that restricting text claims to an unrecognized single term like bioengineered would be burdensome and expensive for food companies and misleading to consumers. And ultimately, this law is only meaningful if consumers understand what the label says. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how robust everything else in the standard is if when people look at a food package, they can't tell what all that work was that went into making sure it either was or wasn't non-GMO, then it's really not helpful. The second part of this is symbols. And so again, the rule must allow for disclosure using plain English terms that people understand. This is probably the most horrifying part of the draft rule to me. You can see these three pictures over here on the right that you might be wondering what the heck is that. That is actually the label that they are proposing be used to indicate to the public that a food product contains GMOs. So they literally have invented an acronym, BE, which I suppose stands for bioengineered, but I've been working in this space for 11 and a half years. I've never heard of this acronym. We just ran a Google search term. It's not like BE food is literally not a thing that a single person has ever searched for. It's just not understood at all. So this is really misleading. The other problem with these labels is you might be noticing that one in the middle is like winking and smiling. It's completely unacceptable. There is a requirement that these labels be neutral. And if you look by comparison at the Agriculture Marketing Service, which is the branch of USDA responsible for this rule, the other programs that they oversee include USDA Process Verified and USDA Organic. You can see those are like very neutral and straightforward labels over there on the left, and then the contrast with these smiley face sparkling labels is just ridiculous. So an important part of comment is that the symbols need to not convey, they should not convey a stylistic bias that gives people positive, happy feelings in association with BE. And they obviously need to include the acronym that the public recognizes, which is GMO or GE would be acceptable also. Okay, so the final part is accessibility, QR codes, and text messages. So this has been a long-standing issue that I'm sure many of you have heard about. This draft rule would allow QR codes for disclosure. Those are scannable codes that require a smartphone and a broadband connection. So they inherently discriminate against more than 100 million Americans who don't have access to smartphones and or a broadband connection. It especially impacts rural, low-income, minority, and elderly populations. And the USDA was required by the law that was passed in 2016 to conduct a survey, a research into whether or not QR codes were accessible, and their own report showed that no, QR codes are not accessible. So they have no place in this rule. They should not be allowed. Plain English using acronyms that people and terms that people recognize are the only acceptable methods of disclosure. The draft also came up with a new disclosure option of a text method where you can send a text and get an answer. Both of these options are time-consuming and unrealistic. I know I can speak as a mom of a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. There is no way that while I'm rushing through the grocery store, I'm going to have time to be pulling out my smartphone and or sending text messages to find out. I just want to be able to see in plain English on the label, is this product genetically engineered? Is it GMO? So again, This is a really important point for comment, is to make sure that the disclosure is clear and familiar and is presented in a straightforward way that supports meaningfulness and transparency. Finally, again, it's really important that the public has a reasonable opportunity to comment further. This draft is not a complete draft. It leaves many significant questions unanswered. I would say by comparison, at the Non-GMO project, we go through regular public comment periods with our standard, and our approach is similar to what the USDA started, which is like first we accept comments on any part of the standard, and then we run those comments through our standards committee, and we actually develop a proposed change, and we put that out for second comment period. So if in that second comment period there's something where we have an unresolved question and we're not ready to say we think the change should be this, and instead we have to ask, we're not sure, we could go this way, we could go that way, what do you think? Our terms of reference require that we go into a third round of public comment. And that's simply because to support transparency and stakeholder engagement, it's really important that people understand what a standard may change to before it actually happens and have a chance to comment on that. This, again, there are so many unanswered questions in the draft that was put out. It's really not complete. Many of the things that the USDA asks about in the preamble aren't even explicitly reflected anywhere yet in the short draft standard that was published. And because of the technical complexity of this issue, there are really critical dependencies within the rule. So depending how they decide one thing, it has implications for somewhere else. And until we can see a fully developed draft that has clear direction on all of those things, it's impossible really to comment adequately. So we believe strongly that the public should have another opportunity to comment. After this comment period, USDA can take comment in and really fully developed a robust and complete draft standard, and then there should be an opportunity to comment again. So a key issue recap, these are all of the things that we've covered. First of all, in inclusion and meaningfulness, the importance of detectability. It needs to include new GMOs as well as things that have been refined and processed. The definition should be the Codex definition, which is comprehensive enough to include new GMOs. The threshold should be low. They should use the 0.9% threshold. The testing methodology needs to be robust. It needs to be PCR. There should be valid sampling plans. There should be accredited labs doing the testing. And the list of bioengineered food should be updated at least quarterly and should include reasonable thresholds. Then on clear labeling, the importance of the text claim language, that terms should be specifically genetically engineered should be an allowed term. The terms should not be restricted only to bioengineered, which is a medical term that's not understood by consumers and not used in the food industry. The symbols need to be changed so that they include the recognized acronym, either GMO or GE, and not a newly invented acronym. And they also should be neutral in keeping with AMS's other logos like process, verified, and organic. In terms of accessibility, QR codes and text messages are not acceptable. We need plain English on the package. And finally, again, it is really important that we have an opportunity to comment further once a more developed standard is available. So steps for action, final slide on how you can take all of that input and express it to the USDA. So a reminder that the comments are due by July 3rd. Here's the link for submitting comments via the federal e-rulemaking portal. This is all also available on the Non-GMO project website for reference. The comments should include, here's the information that needs to be in the header. And I'm just going to jump down to the final point, which is that we actually have a downloadable template with all of this information available on our website. So you can download it. The headers will be in there, the prompt where you can include background information about your organization with a focus on why your perspective on this is valuable, and then your comments on the rule. And there's some placeholders built out based on the content in this webinar, but we really invite and encourage you to make it your own and add your own insight and comments as well. So that's everything for today. Again, thank you all so much for your time and for paying attention to this really critical issue. It really, with so many things unanswered in this rule, individual comments are going to be really meaningful and important. So thank you for taking the time to give input. And also, please feel free to reach out to us if you need help or are looking for suggestions for your comments. Thank you very much.